Welcome back. All right, another episode of Decentralized Me, and today we have a very special guest who I've known for a short time. I'm actually really excited to talk to him, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation today. I want to introduce you to Dr. Alex Boyer. Hey, Alex, how are you?
Hi, I'm really good, thanks. It's great to be here. Nice to see you, Matt.
Yeah, great to see you as well. And Alex is coming to us all the way from the UK, so excited to have him for the evening. And Alex, just to kick things off, I'd love to learn just a little bit more about your background. It's such an interesting background and the work you've been doing. But
Mm.
for our audience, tell them a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, sure. My background is originally as a computer scientist. I did my undergraduate degree in computer science way back in 2000, and then kind of spent a few years working as a software engineer in big tech like IBM and OpenText, and then kind of moved into academia. And I spent 7 years doing a PhD in what I call human data relations. So it's like a multidisciplinary degree combining computer science and social science, human computer interaction, and we've kind of been looking at the lived experience of what it's like to live in the world where companies have your data and you get cut out of the loop. Yeah, and then following on from that, more recently, I was working at My Data Global, which is an international nonprofit focused on improving people's digital rights and helping to improve policy and helping to improve the landscape for entrepreneurs and innovators, which obviously closely aligns to that. So I'm very happy to talk about some of that stuff today.
Yeah, yeah. So it's an amazing background, and I do realize, hearing you talk about human data relations, you're probably the guy I want to talk to when the cyborgs become a reality. You're probably the guy that I need to talk to understand what's actually going on. So, well, thanks. I think to kick things off, I'd love to understand, like, for an ordinary person, what is human centric?
Yeah, I think it's a really important question. I think the term human-centric gets thrown around a lot, and certainly some companies and providers that use it don't always quite do the ethically right thing that I would consider human-centric. But I think for me, it's a lot about the relationship that ordinary person has with the data holding organization. And like during my PhD, I looked at how people are treated through data and came to realize that like data is often used as a proxy for actually involving the person. Because once companies have got data, it's very easy to not bother talking to users as much anymore. And it's easy to assume that that data gives you an accurate picture, but in fact, it's almost always out of date, incomplete, or biased, can create unfair or inaccurate impressions. So in my thesis, I looked at what a healthy relationship with a data holding organization looks like. People need to be able to see and understand and use their data for their own benefit. And I think that's what it means to be human centric. And also there's this aspect that you have relationships with organizations that hold your data, but can't see it. And in those cases, you need transparent processes. You need the ability to oversee and intervene to correct mistakes or add explanations. And you need to be involved in decisions that are made based on that data. Because the thing is, you can never really tell the full story of someone's life through data. So, in terms of what changes for the ordinary person, I think it's about being treated like a human in the service relationship rather than a data record. Whether you're trying to correct a mistake on your energy bill or contest an unfair algorithmic decision or something, it's about that service provider valuing and respecting you, and you being in control and having a voice in what your digital self looks like and how you're seen and judged.
An example I would give, in that scenario is like credit scores as an example, right? Where if I went when I last went and bought a house, right, you kind of go through your credit score and you realize like, well, hey, I don't even know what. Do you think, in terms of like human centric and building solutions to help people have visibility on it, for example, like is that as simple as like a dashboard?
I think that's an important first step. I often say, like, you can't possibly be empowered if you can't even see what data exists. So I think visibility of the data is the first thing. But something I found as well from research into like helping people do GDPR requests to get their data back is it's not enough to just give people a bundle of data and say, there you go, now you're in power. It's like it doesn't work like that because people need to be able to understand the data. So not just like tables of figures, that needs to be contextualized. And for example, when I worked with Hestia, they've done some great work with the DigiPower Academy, which actually presents your data back to you in graphs and visual ways that lets you actually interrogate and explore it. So it's more than just making the data available, it's making it understandable. And as I say, ideally being able to use it for your own needs as well.
How big of an impact does like moment in time have on that? Because I often find like with my personal data, usually it comes up at a specific moment in time where I'm like, oh, I need this, or there's something that needs to get done with a specific set of data that I have.
Yeah, I mean, the time aspect is important, and I think time's really interesting because it's sort of the aspect that binds all the data together and makes it relate to your life. Like if you can scroll back to across events and things that have happened in your life, then suddenly that data makes a lot more sense. And I think the gotcha for companies is just realizing that any data you have is just a snapshot from a moment in time. So it's important to contextualize that and realize that it's already out of date the moment it's collected. So you have a responsibility to maintain a relationship with the user who is the source of that data to be able to check it and verify it
Yeah.
each time you want to rely on it.
So from a company standpoint, what do you think is the upside of giving users more control and more access and more visibility into their data?
It's a great question. I think naturally people assume that if you start putting the user first too much, you're going to be working against the business interests. But actually, that isn't the case. And part of the my data philosophy is that with a more healthy human-centric approach to data, you can actually hit both goals. You can serve the business needs and the individual needs better. So it's really important to identify the business benefits of human-centric thinking because it's only through businesses adopting more human-centric practices that we're going to see change happen. When I looked at this in my thesis, I identified quite a few benefits for businesses, and one of the most important is trust. When users are cut out of the loop, or misunderstood, or misclassified, or just think that they've been treated unfairly because of what the organization's inferred about them from their data, they end up losing trust in that company, and that, of course, can harm the bottom line. So in my research I did with people making GDPR requests, I found that people lost huge amounts of trust in providers when their requests to see data were handled poorly or when the data wasn't clear or useful. Like 52% of the cases that I talked about, people lost trust in companies just from doing that GDPR process. And I did find in some small cases though that when organizations treated people really humanely and explained their data and respected the individual, those people saw an increase in trust and loyalty, like 14% of the cases from that study. So trust is a big one. And I think that also ties into the fact of how businesses present themselves around ethical data use. You look at companies like Apple with its on-device processing and Proton, who differentiates themselves on privacy. These companies are showing that ethical design can be commercially successful and a differentiator. So it's not just NGOs and startups that care about this stuff. But moving on from trust as well, I think another key benefit for companies for giving users more involvement and control is consent. With GDPR and all the various new regulations in the EU, the onus is increasingly on businesses to validate and ensure that they're using data in ways that the individual has agreed to. And if you start to think of this more as a kind of dynamic consent approach, where you're continually checking that people have given consent. The open way of centralizing data works much better. Customers can be kept in the loop, and the fact that they're involved implies a certain amount of buy-in because if they're kept informed and given a voice, then they're going to be able to speak up much earlier, express their approval or disapproval, and that enables the business to adapt much earlier to those any changes that need to be made and protect itself against these allegations of violating consent. So we've got trust, we've got consent. Another one, a couple of other implications that come from this. If the data subject, the person that the data is about, is kept in the loop, then you've got the best placed person to spot any errors right there in the middle of things. So increasing people's involvement is going to lead to higher quality data because people will naturally speak up when something is inaccurate or unfair. And what's more, having a human in the picture means you can easily dig into the full story or explanation behind the data, which gives you a much better context. So we've got trust, we've got consent, we've got accuracy. Another benefit relating to consent is that storage of personal data, especially health or financial data, is increasingly becoming a big liability for businesses. You can risk huge legal or financial penalties or repercussions if there's data misuse or a data breach, or even just decisions made based on bad data. So, in a human-centered mode, businesses can outsource some of those responsibilities of holding data to third parties, such as data trusts or personal data store providers, and that removes a lot of their liability. And then one of the biggest benefits that human-centric can bring, I think, is better customer targeting. We look at the way the internet works today, the established ways of advertising your product and service. It's all about what's your best guess. You're trying to reach as many people as possible in the hope that they might buy. And the surveillance economy kind of extends this by trying to collect more data about people and learn more about people in order to increase the chances you might reach the right people. But some of the innovative models from the human centric space, like VRM, vendor relationship management, kind of turn this on its head, because in that model people willingly and consciously share their very specific targeted data about their needs and profile. It's kind of like putting projects out to tender, and so this removes a lot of that guesswork for companies. And suddenly you can spend a lot less money because you've got a set of people who definitely have a specific product or service need, instead of that just being a possibility. So overall, I think there's like big benefits to both parties when companies start to think of data as a co-owned resource curated with that individual's involvement, rather than a company asset to be sort of taken as gospel and locked away out of the individual's visibility or reach.
Yeah, yeah, and I think I like your example of Proton, right? And I kind of refer to it as like trust is a feature, right? And as you build a product or as you're building a solution, right? Trust is a inherent feature of your platform, which has many different benefits, right? Potentially to the end user. One of the things is you're kind of talking about this too, and coming from a marketing background, right? As you say, well, it's quality versus quantity, right? Like, and Facebook's a great example of that, right? Where I can go, I have all sorts of levers and options in terms of my targeting. So I think
Yeah.
the ROI becomes, whether you're on the marketing side, whether you're on the product side, right? It's
Mhm.
all about ROI, right? And being able to build a business
Yeah.
around that.
Yeah, and that has those societal benefits too, because suddenly then the companies are not so compelled to harvest as much data as possible. They can just go, oh, well, look, there's somebody who says they want to buy a bike or get a new car or whatever. We don't need to collect and harvest that data by surveilling them. We can just ask them.
Yeah, there's a recent TechCrunch article on browsers and talking about the level of data that's collected by each type of browser. Using Chrome as an example, and Chrome, they said, at any given time is tracking 20 different categories of data about a user as they go through the internet: location, usage, etc. There's a bunch of things. Safari tracks eight. And they're saying, well, hey,
Yeah,
like, eight is much better than 20. It's like, well, that's true,
yeah,
but it's
yeah,
still eight, right? And
yeah.
there's kind of this like constantly, people are like you said, surveilling you, right, as you do that. And so it definitely kind of looking at that user. And I've heard you say this before, is like the individual really should be the point of integration, right? And the
Yeah.
user being kind of the focal point of making things happen. From your
Mhm.
perspective, like, what does that actually look like technically, right? It could be data spaces, it could be wallets, it could be, again, it could be storage. But maybe you can talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, yeah, sure, sure. I mean, I don't have a favorite technology when it comes to human centricity. I think there's many different approaches, and the ones you've listed are definitely some of the key ones. I think I'd possibly also add interoperability protocols like JLink or FedID to that list as a key part of the picture as well. But for me, whichever technology it is, the main thing is that you're talking about a technology that gives the user a role in being the point where credentials or digital self data or personal data are collected, but also that technology has to be not only offering a direct service to the user, but also doing it in a way that guarantees the user is in control. And that can be achieved legally, like by a data trust or an intermediary having some sort of fiduciary duty to keep that data safe and in the user's control. Or it could be technical, like processing data on device or end-to-end encryption. Or it could be more about having a business model that respects users' roles. Like if we think about the difference between some of the big AI providers like OpenAI and some of the smaller, more ethical ones like Kin AI or Pi. At the most basic level, there needs to be some ability for users to log in, to see and understand their data, and to see and revoke and grant permissions over how that data is used. And so long as the technology is doing that, and there are many great models out there for doing that, I think it doesn't really matter which one.
So is it as simple as giving people the ability to manage their permissions, right? Is it as simple as that, or do you think it's there's more complexity under the hood?
I mean, as I hinted at before, I think there is more complexity. It's not just about a dashboard of permissions. And also, you got to remember that that's work for people. And so you got to respect the fact that people in their lives don't necessarily have time to understand what all these permissions mean. So you've got to make it meaningful to people. You've got to give them the ability to see and use their data. Not just, we all fill in forms when we use websites and so on, and that data just disappears. You never see it again. So it's about like if I put data in on a form, it should be there and it should be editable. If you inferred some things about my kind of life from my interactions, then I should be able to view that list and say, "Oh, actually, you've got this one wrong." When I don't know if you've ever tried to ask Facebook or Instagram about what they think you like, what they actually selling you to advertisers on. It's very interesting to look at that, and you just go, they think I'm interested in that. What? Where did they get that from? It's just completely wrong.
Yeah,
So
yeah. I
being able to see it.
I recently asked ChatGPT to create a profile about myself
Uh-huh.
based on my queries, and interesting enough, there I did this in two ways. One is I said, well, hey, create a profile of like what I like to do based on the type of things I ask, and then two is like give me my strengths and weaknesses like as a professional employee, right? And I would say like
Mhm.
professionally, I was like, wow, this is it's pretty spot on. In terms of my
Mhm.
weaknesses and strengths, but from a personal standpoint, it's like, well, hey, it's like way off in a, it's off in another region, right? And I have no ability to kind of control or influence that outside of just giving it more inputs, right? Which in the end
Yeah,
is I always equate these conversations back to like doctors' offices, right? And the fact that when I go to a doctor office, I really have no ability to control the forms, the data, the information that I give them. And in fact, it's usually the opposite, right? The doctor's office has full control over everything, and then they decide what I can see as I do that. And
yeah.
I think this is a perfect scenario of kind of describing that and saying, well, hey, it's in an ideal world, right? It's actually the other way around, right? It kind of leads me to my next question as we're thinking about this. And you're really one of my go-to experts around like my data again, like data privacy, human-centric design, and one of the things
Mhm.
like working with a lot of companies who are building products, they're building apps, they're building services. Um, as you think about, and I'm not going to go through the six core principles of my data, but from a company
Yeah.
standpoint, like, which ones, like, based on your experience, do organizations typically struggle with? And why do you think that is as they go through that?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question because there's so much like loaded in that question, and I think for me that sort of assumes that organizations have already got the desire and intent and financial incentives to pursue these objectives, but often they don't. And for example, current online business models actually incentivize businesses against being interoperable and against data portability because data is seen as a valuable asset, and portability is like a direct threat to subscriber loyalty and customer retention, and empowering individuals with new capabilities. Like it was so much easier in a world where we kind of sold software to you on a disk and you'd take that home and your relationship with the customer ends when you bought your product because features and capabilities were a big differentiator. But when you've got this SaaS model where you've got an ongoing need to reduce costs, there's lots of incentives for companies to reduce feature sets and focus on feature designs that prioritize business goals rather than individual empowerment. So for me, I don't think any of the six principles are particularly difficult to pursue. I think it wouldn't be a struggle, except perhaps around interoperability, which I think needs a lot of parties on the same page and ideally some sort of involvement from government and regulators. But with that possible exception, I think generally it's not the principles that are difficult. It's the real struggle of shifting your business's mindset to one which puts individual empowerment and all these other needs first, even with an awareness of that kind of digital landscape, which is trying to encouraging you to work against those goals.
Do you, I guess the question I always come back to is like, why do you think companies make it so hard to take your data elsewhere? Uh,
Um, I, I think it's just the way the internet evolved. The internet was started out free. People expected it to be free, so then people had to develop models based on that. So it's like advertising was one of the big ones, and then subscriptions as well. And so that became the dominant model. And as more and more businesses went online, cloud computing means cutting costs, reducing features, solving your user interface for everyone instead of like those niche edge cases for users. So I think it's just the internet economy has developed that has led businesses to focus on doing things in a way that we would necessarily now consider as individual centric or human centric.
Yeah, as you're talking, by the way, my what goes off in my mind is business opportunities, right? So if I look at how companies struggle, or I look at some of these challenges, I view that as an opportunity to say, hey, these are actually business problems that we can go and solve.
Yeah,
A better product, a better service, as you do that,
absolutely. Yeah.
and
Increasingly, that's becoming a way that people can differentiate themselves in the market by showing that they're doing these things more ethically and more user first.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And related to that, so as we're talking about kind of like human centric design, and again some of the challenges, what one company I'd love to get your, and not company, but product industry I would like to kind of focus in on is like potentially would be challenged, right, with the shift in this model, and that's centralized AI, right? So if I think about
Yeah, yeah.
Gemini, ChatGPT, Nova,
Mhm.
you name it,
Mhm.
what do as these AI systems are kind of like just vacuuming up the data, right, to train their models and
Mhm.
just
Mhm.
consuming,
Mhm.
I take like Grok and X, and they're just using X as like a basically an AI a training data set. What, from your perspective, like what breaks when we bolt on human centric
Yeah,
data philosophy as we do this?
yeah. You're right. It is already a sort of discongruous thing. I think AI as it is now, the big guys like you said, ChatGPT, Gemini, Meta, so on, they're unfortunately defaulting to a continuation of this sort of surveillance economy model. And I've seen coverage recently about the idea that AIs are going to start using things learned from your AI chats to market to you. And that's because those businesses are all very embedded into that existing mindset, big, powerful platforms and tiny, powerless users. So I think that can really entrench and worsen the power imbalances we already have. And there are some AI companies out there doing it in a more ethical way, like Kin AI, for example, or Claude to a certain extent, keeping people in control of their own data rather than just amassing data on the platform side. But I would certainly say that's not the main direction of travel. So my worry is that we'll see in the AI sphere a sort of expansion of those dark patterns of data collection that we already see on the commercial web, and it'll be disguised as personalization and dressed up like it's in our interests, but really it's disempowering users, it's creating consent fatigue, and it's just collecting more and more knowledge for them to advertise to you. And I think that's very much the wrong way to go about it. So I think we need a more personal rather than personalized approach to what AI does for us.
Yeah, it's so interesting as you talk about that, because I think about using the AI chats that I do today. Really, basically I'm giving them data to go and target ads to me, and kind of constantly providing information to them. And I compare that to like some of the work like ArcBlock is doing, and for some of the products we're building, right, is kind of this vision of like personal AI assistants that basically learn from you, like from your phone's data, like as you're interacting with it. It's not actually learning from the cloud, but in fact, it's learning from your interactions, things you like to
Yeah,
do,
yeah,
and really becomes like an AI that kind of respects your data, so to speak. But I think from a challenge standpoint, there's so many barriers already being put in front of companies, products, people to do something like that. Because one of the simplest examples would be is like part of the reason I use ChatGPT or Gemini is like the speed of it is amazing, right? The fact that I can go and interact with it, it processes it, and gives me a response. Depending if it's deep research or not, but it'll give me a response within seconds, right? And
yeah,
if
yeah.
if I try to use a more privacy centric AI, I may
Mhm.
wait 10 seconds, 15 seconds.
Yeah,
There's
yeah.
definitely more of a gap there. Do you see a future where AI models are trained at the edge or in personal data spaces instead of kind of the hyperscale silos that we see today?
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely think that's where things should go. I mean, as I've mentioned, I think there's strong market forces working against that, but I think AI offers huge opportunities, especially when it comes to the idea of having personal AI assistants and agents, because they can be much more focused on giving new capabilities to individuals and to individually empowering people. And it's clear that to do that, those AIs will have a better context and understanding of individual needs if they're based on good like holistic data about the user's life that encompasses multiple aspects of yourself, rather than just that thin slice that one particular platform provider can see in their own data.
Hmm.
So yeah, I do think AIs that hook into people's own devices or personal data spaces, looking at like individuals rather than demographics or populations, could be really empowering to people. And I think also it's going to be an easier sell to people because obviously you're going to trust, well, provided that the reputation of the provider is good, you're going to trust that AI agent is just doing what it's supposed to be doing and not reporting back to base with lots of surveillance about you.
As you're talking about that, because one of the things I think about is like if I look at and not to say everybody should do this, right? But if you go in and you're in your browser and you look at the developer tools, and
Mhm.
one of the things that you kind of quickly see is how many websites have third-party code
Oh yeah,
somewhere,
it's huge.
somewhere in the website. And from a
Yeah.
trust standpoint, like I was never made aware of that. It was never shown to me. It was never approved. Um, I think
Mhm.
that's potentially like an opportunity or an area where it's like, well, hey, one area you can look at is like third party code hygiene, right? And doing an audit of like how much third party code do I actually have.
Yeah, people are always shocked by how far their data is spreading. Absolutely. We did some good studies on that at Hestia when Citra with the DigiPower project. And yeah, finding just how much your data gets spread all over the world in seconds. It's quite scary.
Yeah, it's definitely scary. I'm always interested as the builders, right? And so even as I'm talking about developer tools and looking at all third party code, like in the end, that's all about builders, right? And people who are creating the
Yeah, yeah.
apps, building the solutions. And last
Mhm.
year, you ran a designing a personal data ecosystem workshop.
Yeah.
So as you're working with these companies, like what surprised you the most about
Mm,
gaps that the operators have,
mm,
or
mm,
areas where there just wasn't coverage, and you're like, oh, that's interesting because I would
mm.
have expected them to have that.
Yeah, I think, I mean, it was a great workshop with lots of different opinions and ideas, and I can possibly summarize them all. But the goal of it was to try and imagine like what is the ecosystem around an individual, rather than like just thinking about the platform ecosystems or service ecosystems that we exist within. But one of the big pain points that came up, and something that operators need in order to build better, more holistic tools, is that the sort of standards and interoperability pieces that would be able to allow us to connect different parts of a user's digital life together. I've been saying for a while that we need to shift from thinking about buckets of data to thinking about data as indicators and pieces of a user's life information. We don't yet have strong semantic standards for representing just simple facts about people or the events in their lives and so on. And I think we need that. It's these challenges of interoperability are always going to be difficult when you've got lots of different parties, each trying to have their own model of data. There needs to be more cooperative work on finding new information standards and protocols. And crucially, I think that's kind of a political problem, that there has to be some central authority or regulations that says these are the standards we're using, and provides operators and other organizations with some kind of backbone for interoperability to hang on all the different efforts on. And, until that happens, there's always going to be problems with different actors creating different models and standards. It's like they're talking different languages. Someone says, "Hey, we've got a new standard," and now you've just got one more of multiple standards. It's really, really one of the most critical problems in this space, I think. And it was definitely a hot topic of conversation in that session. It's not easy because deciding semantic standards involves reflecting and making many decisions about how to classify the world. Be it social, political, or those cultural power struggles we have of what gets measured and what gets valued. As soon as you summarize and classify things, you're making decisions. So it's very much a sort of socio-technical problem, not just a technological one. But yeah, sorry, long answer, but interoperability definitely is the key area for me.
How do you think you solve the interoperability challenge when some of the cases I've seen is typically the companies who are creating the standards are also the companies who have skin in the game for one path versus another path, so to speak. And as we think about interoperability, one of the challenges that I've seen over the years, right, is that many times the people who are building the standards are also the people who have skin in the game to go one pathway versus another pathway. From your perspective, like, is there a way to help solve that problem, or make it easier for companies
Yeah.
to align around a
Yeah,
standard?
yeah, yeah. I think it's good for companies who want to do standards to be a bit reflective and say, why are we pushing this particular standard?
Yeah.
And if it's, if for some reason, like we want people to align to our platform, then that's probably not really a standard. That's probably that's like a personal API of that platform. So I think that there has to be a genuine desire to make standards that are not just of value to your product or service, but to others as well. So, a good place to start might be working with at least one other external company to say what's common across our two platforms or services that we can sort of abstract away to some model. And I think another thing that can help us if we look at some of the thinking from the semantic web, a lot of that is about addressability, and being able to say this thing is called an X according to company A, but this thing is called a Y according to company B. That if you've got that addressability to give things names, but to say named as that by this entity,
Hmm.
then you can start to map concepts together. So even when companies have their own models, they can still be, if you like, translated. And I think that's so critical to be able to connect them together.
Yeah. Yeah, interesting. Interesting. Well, that's a big problem. You and I can take another hour on another day, and we'll solve all the
Yeah,
challenges of
yeah,
interoperability for everybody. So
yeah, yeah. I wish.
so you ran the workshop working with companies, for startups, right? And this applies to a lot of like ArcBlock's customers, for example. What can they do to build in a way that protects user data?
Well, I think adopting privacy by design is the strongest strategy. If we look at what some of the ethical privacy-centric providers like Proton or Nord or Signal, or some of the my data operators like Hestia, Geens NPO, and Kin AI are doing, they're all building systems with end-to-end encryption where it's technically impossible for staff members at the provider to be able to access user data. So that's like the most obvious one. It's perhaps the most technically difficult one, but if you can pull it off, that is like guaranteed trust for the users. But I think even without that, there are steps that can be taken to be more ethical. For example, building in strong privacy respecting design choices, such as never training your AI models on user data without explicit consent, or data minimization, only collecting the bare minimum information that's needed to do the job. I think another thing that startups need to be aware of is because obviously they're often financially constrained. A lot of those supposedly free tools like Google Analytics or Facebook Audience Network or OpenID, they offer a quick, easy way to deliver value to web developers. They quickly get that button on your website or target that audience demographic or whatever. But that is always done at the expense of sending back data back to Facebook or Google or whoever. And when I was doing the DigiPower research study with Citra and Hestia, we looked into the ways that platforms collect that user data through other parties. So the big platforms are actually, if you like, almost tricking small
Mm,
startups into being data hoovers, data vacuums
right.
for them to collect all the data. Um, but the bottom line, though, is, and you hinted at this earlier, this idea that startups really need to do a kind of third-party code hygiene audit as a default best practice. You need to ensure that not just all your code, but all the third-party code you use doesn't collect or share users' data, except in very tightly constrained scopes where you can guarantee how that data is used. And crucially, they need to be able to explain exactly how they're using user data and make some guarantees. So don't start like adding in extra tech stacks unless you can guarantee what those tech stacks are going to do to your customers' data.
Yeah, it's many challenges for startups, right? But I kind of come back to something we were talking about earlier. It's the trust as a feature, right? And using that as a benefit and an opportunity, right, to bring more ROI and get people interested in your product. So, on a different
Mhm.
note, and let's kind of flip this question. If you were sitting, I'll say I'm a chief data officer, and if you were sitting next to me in a cafe, what is the one practice you would ask me to start Monday morning, to help build more
Yeah.
kind of privacy centric solutions?
I think I would say work on being able to describe exactly and simply and understandably, maybe in like a simple one-page document, what data about people your organization collects, how you use it, how you store it, what you observe and infer, what you use it for, and what you share, if any, and what your partners and subsidiaries do with it. And it's vital that you can explain that to your users if you expect them to have trust in you. And once it's written down in plain and readable form, like think about how you can make that data and those processes more visible and inclusive for users. Because human-centric design isn't about giving a dashboard, as we said. It's like giving users a seat at the strategy table. And then once you sort of start to reflect on that, like really stop and look at the explanation you've created. Like think about whether if you were to read that explanation of what you're doing with data as a layperson, how would you feel about those practices ethically? Would you feel respected and included? Would it feel fair? And if you as a chief data officer were to stop thinking of data as sort of an asset to be harvested and hoarded and start seeing it as like a living, flowing dialogue between yourselves and the person behind the data, how would you rewrite that summary of your data handling? And that should really inform, I think, how you need to think differently about how you might be inclined to use that customer data. If I was to sum it up as a bottom line, it's like if you can't explain your data practices to a 12-year-old, you probably can't defend them ethically either.
It's the classic mom rule, right? If I can't explain it to my mom, then it's probably not right,
Yeah,
right? And
exactly.
the example I think of as you talk about that is privacy policies, and I think about when is the last time I actually read a privacy policy? Probably not recently, and the reason being is because it's like 30 pages long and full of dense legal jargon that for all intents and purposes I can't understand. I don't know what the ins and outs of that being, but I use that as a great example. It's like, well, hey, if you can't clearly define what your privacy policy is in a way that people can understand, like, what's the value of it? Like thinking 5 years out from today, right? Kind of like we're thinking about startups, we're thinking about mid-market enterprise. What is potentially, from your perspective, the catalyst that makes human-centric data a default, right? Is it regulation? Is it demand? Is it technology? Is it AI that actually does that?
Mm. Yeah. I wish it wasn't the case, but I'm convinced that better regulation and more precisely enforcement is essential. Like too much of the world has got surveillance economy and attention economy thinking hard baked into it, and is financially incentivized to like keep moving towards greater and greater data use, which is going to disempower more people through controlling their data and removing features. So there is an interplay between technology, regulation, and market forces. But today, I think enforcement is the real missing muscle today. And without any real teeth to the regulations, there'll be very little impetus for companies to change. That said, I do see some glimmers of hope for the other sort of motivators in terms of the potential of human-centric AI, personal assistants, and apps. I think they can really highlight the kind of life-centric gaps in today's mostly platform-centric offerings. But I think that fundamentally the sort of inadequacies of today's digital world is very much a socio-technical problem. We can't solve it with technology alone. We have to look at the whole picture, and that includes education, not just of people and citizens, but of providers, business owners, and such, and technologists. Um, and regulation and the disconnect between market forces, which are kind of working against these factors we talked about, and people's everyday lives and the things they need that are going in a different direction. So I think we also need to see like human-centric thinking being modeled and kind of radiating out from governments and national authorities and everything they do as well, because they're the people who can set standards and digital identity infrastructure and data infrastructure. If they can mandate and normalize that as a standard part of everyday life that everyone can count on, then that's something people can trust in and providers can build around. So it could come from those angles, but as I say, I think it's through good policies and good regulation and good enforcement that we'll actually see the market be forced to change.
Do you think there's any chance that AI assistants can go in the right direction from where they are today in terms of just driving a more privacy centric or kind of data?
Yeah, yeah, I think so. I mean, there's plenty of like when we look at them as sort of like personal assistants, that's more like your butler or your little assistant to do whatever it is, manage your day or help you with fitness or whatever it is. Like those are focused on real like life-centric goals. And I think what's exciting about that is whereas people don't really care about the world of data very much, but they do care about making their life easier. And suddenly, previously, one of the things that's been a big challenge in the my data space is how do you get people to care about this ethical data stuff? Well, they don't. They think data's boring. but it's much a much easier sell if it's like, well, we can give you this tool that's going to give you a new capability in your life that none of those big platform guys are giving you. Then they go, oh, well, this little AI actually helps make my life better. Oh, and by the way, it's also, handling my data ethically or using a data lock or whatever. It's like a much easier sell. So I think there is hope in that.
Thank goodness. I need somebody to help
Mhm.
me for sure. Last good question here. This has been amazing, and you and I could probably do this, half the day and talk about data centric solutions.
Yeah.
I'm curious from your perspective. Again, like what's the biggest myth out there today, I think?
Yeah, yeah, sure. And it's something I was just starting to allude to a little bit in my last
Mm,
answer, but I think the average man on the street, like the myth I'd like to debunk is that data is fundamentally irrelevant and boring to relevant to your everyday life. The reality is data is a mirror of your life, and like every tap, every purchase, every search, every health check, it's all getting encoded as data. Data is facts and observations and inferences about our lives.
mm,
And that's how businesses are understanding us, and that's how advertisers are influencing us, and it's how decisions that affect our lives are getting made. And what I find in my research is that once people realize that data isn't just some boring spreadsheet, it's actually information about their life written down, being used, suddenly that becomes a lot more relevant and a lot more something to care about. And I think today it's almost impossible for people to understand and keep track of their data, and people aren't like screaming out for data tools, but people aren't disinterested in how that's being used. They're just disempowered. And,
mm,
and, and it's not that they don't care about their data, it's just that the tools to see it and understand it and act on it as information about their lives just don't exist yet. And so people can't really buy or say, oh, I want this, when they've never really seen it or imagined it.
mm,
So that's something I'd say to kind of the average man on the street. But if I kind of like to give a sort of business answer as well, and,
mhm,
and I think one thing I'd like to say to business folks is it's time to start thinking differently about the data your company holds. It's very tempting to view it as a sort of static asset to be collected and augmented and locked away as a source of, profit or power. But really, like all databases are biased. They're not neutral. The data is always out of date, and they're never a complete picture of an individual. Can't be relied upon. Has to be actively maintained. A much better way to think about data is to sort of think of it as like a river of signals of activity or intents coming from each user. And if you can tap into that flow and follow it back to the individual, you can gain so much. You get access to up-to-date information, and if you can remember to talk to the person behind the data, you can gain real life context about what that data is really telling you about that individual's life. If you set up the flows right, you can become an integrated and trustworthy part of that user's digital workflow and like a valued digital capabilities. So, but if you ignore the human and just see him as a source to harvest data from, you're going to get worse data. You're going to get no trust relationship and no way to really truly look at that individual's life holistically, or integrate yourself into his workflows.
Yeah, it's I would much rather you be part of my story rather than just send me ads, if you will,
Mhm.
right? And
Exactly. Exactly.
it's don't
Yeah.
spend all your time trying to infer what I'm trying to do or what kind of life moment I'm having, but instead, like, if you can make me part of your story, I can actually help tell you.
Yeah.
That
And just respect me as an individual and as a person with needs and desires that aren't necessarily make more money for your company.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I can help you make more money. Just let's do it together.
Mm.
In
Yeah,
terms
yeah,
of
yeah.
so
Give me something useful and I'll pay for it. Yeah.
That's right, Alex. Amazing. I think I could talk to you all day long, and we could. I
Yeah.
really want to have you back again and keep going because I think for people, for example, in the ArcBlock ecosystem, our builders, like people are trying to build these types of solutions today, right? And so again, thank you for taking some time, and look forward to talking to you again.
Yeah. Yeah, you're very welcome. And if you or any of your listeners want to connect with me, I'd be happy to talk to them. You can find me on LinkedIn or Blue Sky. I'm always interested to talk about this stuff.
Awesome, and we'll make sure we drop it in the description as well so they can reach out.
Mhm.
So thanks very much.
Mhm. Thank you.